video game series evolves by introducing bold new mechanics which end up becoming the norm, but it's also fair to say that some concepts don't always hit. Sometimes an ambitious, groundbreaking mechanic leaves large swaths of people cold, but it can certainly get much worse than that. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 ambitious gameplay ideas that broke everything. Number 10, the Batmobile, Batman Arkham Knight. Batman Arkham Knight attempted to expand on the series' open world further still, an awesome idea in theory which many were dying to see and yet ended up being the game's overpowering undoing. As neat as a summonable Batmobile sounds on paper, Rocksteady ultimately made players excessively reliant on the vehicle, enough that it becomes a genuine annoyance. The infamous mandatory tank missions proving especially groan-inducing. Long before the game has reached its end, the Batmobile has outstayed its welcome, proving not merely an example of too much of a good thing, but how horribly misappropriated Batman's greatest quote-unquote gadget could be. It's an addition to the series which ultimately tanks the whole game, turning an otherwise thrilling wish fulfillment exercise into a stamina-annihilating bore. And let's be honest, is there anything worse for a freaking Batman game to be than boring? Number 9, 4 campaigns, Resident Evil 6. Resident Evil 6 marked the biggest yet shift away from the series' survival horror roots towards a more action-centric gameplay, yet ultimately what sunk it for many players was the admittedly bold attempt to seamlessly interweave 4 separate narrative campaigns. The game features 4 storylines featuring Leon, Chris, newcomer Jake, and unlockable Ada Wong, an intriguing strategy to diversify the game from its predecessors, albeit one which quickly outs itself as favouring quantity over quality. Beating the 4 campaigns can take upwards of 20 hours, and the strength of the campaigns is wildly variant. What isn't variant, however, is the gameplay, and everything just kind of blends together into a smooth, bland Resident Evil 6 flavoured paste. This demonstrates that Capcom bit off far more than they could chew with such an expansive storytelling canvas. It's certainly not a lazy effort, but one that spreads itself far too thinly while trying to service too many ideas, in turn becoming the only mainline Resident Evil game that could be genuinely called a slog. Less absolutely would have been more in this case. Instead, Resident Evil 6 is a game few outside of the most die-hard fans can ever bring themselves to replay from start to finish. Number 8, rebuilding the series engine, Assassin's Creed Unity. The release of 2014's Assassin's Creed Unity marked some major under-the-hood changes for the franchise, with Ubisoft pulling off the plaster and giving their Anvil Next engine a major overhaul. Unity's 2.0 version of the engine allowed the developers greater flexibility to generate realistic physics and lighting effects, among many other things, which in theory would have made Unity the most visually stunning Assassin's Creed game up to that point. The problem was Ubisoft rushed Unity out the door before the team had become fully acquainted with the new engine, resulting in the game launching rife with graphical issues and bugs. Within days, social media was flooded with memes mocking the infamous texture problems, where characters' facial textures wouldn't fully load in, leaving a pair of eyes and mouthful of teeth floating in the air without a face. Now, years removed from Unity's release, it remains one of the most visually stunning games of the last decade, but for anyone hoping for a butter-smooth product on release, they were sorely out of luck. In the very least, Unity's horrendous launch prompted Ubisoft to spend an extra year developing the far better received Assassin's Creed Origins. Number 7, motion controls, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. Being specifically designed for the Wii, The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword was designed by Nintendo to take full advantage of the console's groundbreaking motion control tech. And so the original Wii version made motion controls mandatory, with the Wii Motion Plus expansion necessary to play the game. Bringing full-on motion controls to Zelda was a killer idea on paper, especially given the Wii's success with this tech prior to the game's 2011 release, yet in this case they proved unwieldy and unintuitive enough to turn legions of players off Skyward Sword entirely. The motion controls unresponsiveness quickly gets frustrating, all the more so given that Nintendo stubbornly refused to include a more traditional alternate control scheme. This ended up tarnishing the game's standing in the franchise for an entire decade, enough that there are forums full of posts disparaging the enforced motion controls for ruining the game, and even preventing some from beating it outright. For the 2021 Switch re-release, Nintendo finally saw the light and offered an option for an adapted conventional control scheme, although this couldn't fix the game's issues with over-the-top hand-holding and monotonous mechanics. Number 6, the auction house Diablo 3. In Diablo 3's auction house, players could buy, sell, and exchange items with others, both for in-game currency and real-world money. In theory, this was an intriguing idea to combat risky third-party item selling and ensure everything was transacted within the safe boundaries of the game itself. However, the auction house ended up breaking the core Diablo gameplay as fans knew it, effectively encouraging players to obtain items with cold hard cash in a manner perilously close to pay to win. Given that Diablo has always been about the loot grind, the auction house basically de-incentivized the game's entire central loop, enough that even original game director Jay Wilson admitted it was a mistake less than a year after Diablo 3's release. The auction houses were finally removed in March 2014, a little shy of 2 years after the game was released, and let's be honest, by which time most players had long since moved on. Thankfully, at least Diablo 4 didn't repeat the same mistake, keeping the auction house rightfully dead and buried. Number 5. Laws, Final Fantasy Tactics Advance. Final Fantasy Tactics Advance is a genuinely terrific entry into the hit RPG franchise, or it would be were it not for the bold swing and a miss of introducing a laws mechanic. Laws are a series of rules which govern the game's battles, prohibiting the use of certain weapons, spells, items and so on, with law breakers being subject to one of several punishments such as losing money, having offending items confiscated, being thrown in jail, and even having player stats permanently reduced. It's certainly a creative and interesting feature, yet one which, in its attempt to encourage diverse combat tactics, feels obnoxiously restrictive, particularly if you don't have an especially varied party. Combat now becomes a tedious list-checking exercise, and there are times in the game when not breaking a law is nigh on impossible. Ultimately, laws don't make the game more fun. In fact, the fan outcry was vocal enough that Square Enix gave the system a much-needed overhaul for the sequel Final Fantasy Tactics A2, with punishments proving decidedly less severe. Number 4, an advanced physics engine, Jurassic Park Trespasser. Jurassic Park Trespasser may not be a game you know, but its influence in the industry is undeniable. The first-person shooter, developed by DreamWorks Interactive and released in 1998, operated on an extremely ahead-of-its-time game engine, capable of rendering large, expansive outdoor environments, never-before-seen ragdoll physics, and an incredibly advanced dinosaur AI. As a feat of engineering, Trespasser secured its place in the annals of gaming history immediately and was cited by Valve's Gabe Newell as influencing Half-Life 2's groundbreaking physics work years later. The problem, however, is that Trespasser was basically too advanced for most average gaming rigs to run the damn thing properly. On top of that, as a game, it's simply not very fun. So much time was spent developing state-of-the-art tech, and yet the core gameplay is awkward to control, filled with bugs and painfully unintuitive. Trespasser is a terrible game, but in its own way, one that absolutely needed to exist for the tectonic leaps it made in game development. Number 3, Boss Battles, Deus Ex Human Revolution. When Eidos announced that the first Deus Ex game in almost a decade, Human Revolution, would feature full-fat boss battles, there was a lot of cautious optimism for what it could bring to the franchise. With the Deus Ex series being centered around player choice, it seemed reasonable to assume that Human Revolution would give players plentiful non-lethal options to dispatch the bosses, ensuring pacifist and stealth players weren't left up the creek without a paddle. And so what an infuriation it was when the game released and players who didn't invest heavily in combat abilities were left fighting bosses the hard way. Some players were afflicted enough by this that they weren't even able to get past the first one, Lawrence Barrett, forcing them to start the game all over again. Eidos did eventually release a director's cut which remedied this by introducing non-lethal solutions to the bosses, but it obviously wasn't free. It later transpired that the bosses were all outsourced to another studio when the developer ran short of time during production, yet Eidos evidently heard irate fans loud and clear as bosses were near entirely absent from sequel Deus Ex Mankind Divided. Number 2, The Marauder, Doom Eternal. Far away from the series' typical gallery of grotesque monsters, the Marauder is a very different foe entirely. Effectively a devilishly tricky mirror image of Doomguy himself, the Marauder wears similar armour and can't be felled by the typical run-and-gun tactics which work on just about every other enemy. Instead of just blasting away, you need to wait for the Marauder's eyes to flash green, leaving it temporarily vulnerable to your attacks before it throws its unbreakable shield up again. Its sheer slipperiness combined with the strength of its attacks makes the Marauder by far the toughest common enemy in the game. Enough that for many casual players just hoping to blast a fleet of hell beasts back from whence they came, it basically ruined the whole damn experience. More than its mere difficulty though, the Marauder grinds the game's typically frenetic pace down to a slogging halt every time they show up, the ultimate video game killjoy. And number 1, SKELLS, XENOBLADE Chronicles X. Now let's not get it twisted, there are absolutely those who swear by Xenoblade Chronicle X's SKELLS, massive pilotable mechs who are unlocked roughly halfway through the game's 80 or so hour campaign. In theory, they sound fantastic, right? Except they're a glaring example of a seemingly additive feature which only ends up taking away and hampering the rest of the experience. After the initial honeymoon period of the mechs wears off, they trivialise both combat and exploration to the point of tedium, especially once you upgrade your SKELLS flight module and can traverse the game world extremely fast. Now, to be completely fair, you're in no way obligated to use SKELLS for most of the game, nothing stopping you from walking around on foot, but it's clear that developer Monolith Soft wants you to, and that you're basically supposed to. Once those giant hunks of metal show up dozens of hours in, it's game over. It sucks plunging hours into a game only to find out halfway through that there's something about it you really don't like, or perhaps even go so far as to ruin the experience. On the other end of this, there are video games you knew would trash instantly. Check out that video on screen now. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, leave a comment down below on other examples that would have fit within this list. Head over to WhatCulture.com for more content every day. I've been Cy for WhatCulture, and have a good week.